Well, good evening, and thanks for coming back with us. I am Dr. Jacqueline King, the founder of Black Women Empowered Incorporated and Black Women Empowered Safe Haven, where we have over 4 million followers on Facebook, and we're on Instagram, and we're on Pinterest and LinkedIn. We're everywhere. But we are a social media ministry, news, empowering organization. So today we are so blessed to have Miss Cheryl Dorsey with us. You have seen her on MSNBC, CNN. Cheryl, you all over the place. And you know the funny thing is, I was watching TV, and I don't even know. I think it was Court TV, and you came up, and I said, "Oh my goodness!" I said, "I'm calling Cheryl. I said I'm gonna call her because look, we need to get her on." So I am so glad that you are here. And we have a lot to talk about. First of all, introduce yourself. You have such a long resume, but introduce yourself for those who may not know you, which I think that's hard to do.
Well, the Reader's Digest version is, I'm a retired 20-year veteran sergeant of the Los Angeles Police Department. I spent all 20 years working in patrol as a patrol officer and a patrol supervisor. And because of those experiences, it has uniquely situated me to speak credibly and irrefutably on everything that's happening across the country with regards to police and community relations, and more specifically, police and deadly use of force when it comes to Black men, women, and children primarily, but of course no one is immune, and so my brown brothers and sisters and poor white folks get caught up as well. And so I just try to provide insight on policy, training, and give folks the words if they have an opportunity to stand before a police chief, commissioner, or sheriff and ask some really difficult questions about what police reform and accountability really looks like.
Mm-hmm. So first of all, let's go back. What made you choose this field? And tell me a little bit about how it was in Los Angeles, which is probably one of the toughest places to be.
I joined the LAPD in 1980. At that time, I had been working as a stenographer for the Department of Justice, state of California in Los Angeles, and I was a part of a clerical pool working for special agents in the Bureau of Narcotic Enforcement and Bureau of Investigation. Well, in the 80s, PCP was a big deal, and they wanted to do a sting. They were trying to arrest a PCP suspect, young Black guy. And they asked me, since I was one of 2 females working in the clerical pool, if I would pose and engage in a sting. So I did. I said, yeah, that sounds like fun. I was young. And I called the guy up and pretended to be a friend of a friend of a friend and said I was in town and needed a place to stay, and guys being guys, he was like, I can do that. So I had him meet me at a local area restaurant, and in the restaurant were a few patrons, but mostly DOJ agents. And then the guy showed up and they swarmed him, took him into custody. And I was like, is this what you guys do? Because I knew how much money the agents were making, and I knew how much money I was making. So I was thinking, I need your job. They told me what I needed to do to be a special agent, which was go and join on a municipality, stay for a year, get my post, which is Peace Officer Standards and Training Certificate. And with that, I could lateral back to DOJ as a special agent. That was my goal. In 1980, LAPD was under a consent decree to hire more women and more minorities. So I applied for several agencies, but LAPD had an expedited hiring process, and they gave me an academy start date. Once I started the police academy, I learned that LAPD was a pretty large department, and they had all these special places where you could go and work, only they didn't tell me if you look like me, you don't get to work there. I found that out later. But but I also found out that they had a 20-year pension, and I could work for 20 years and draw a pension for the rest of my life. And I was so young, I thought, well, then I'm just gonna stay right here, do this 20 years, and then I'll figure out what I wanna do on the second half of my life. And that's how I came to join the LAPD.
Wow. So you were not really on the street, or were you on the street?
I worked patrol my entire career. Yes.
So you've seen some things. So
Yeah,
back, what year was that?
1980. I started when Daryl Francis Gates was the police chief, and they were not ready for women, and they certainly weren't ready for me when I joined, and they made no bones about it. You know, I did an interview recently with a um, couple of Black men, one who started on a police department in 1960, another started in 2008, and I started in 1980. So we're basically three generations of Black folks on law enforcement. I was the only female, and it was very interesting, but also disheartening to me that as we spoke to the host, it was on NPR, and anyone who wants to hear that broadcast can go to my podcast, Sergeant Dorsey Speaks, because I thought it was so important to share that I put that interview up. But it was very disheartening to hear that the gentleman who started in the 60s went through hell. And, you know, the N word was bantered about, you know, regularly, routinely. And, you know, you would think that him having dealt with that and whatever his trials and tribulations were would have made it easier 20 years later when I came along. Not so much. I went through everything that he had gone through. Our stories were so similar. And then as I listened to the brother from Cleveland who started in 2008, 20 years after me, his stories were identical to mine. And so here we are, three Black folks, three different departments across the country, and nothing had changed in all of that time. And so you understand why we are where we are today.
Wow, that's amazing. I share that podcast with me afterwards, and I will put it on our pages because I think that's something that would be really interesting for our viewers, our listeners to hear that. We would love to hear that. So, tell me about some of the stuff that you had to go through because actually, believe it or not, I went through the Citizens Police Academy. So, you know, it's nothing like what you do. And I actually was good friends with the chief of police in Greensboro. So I got to do an undercover, which was very interesting. And then I did the simulation. Now that thing scared the snoodles out of me, I'm tell you right now, because I was ready to kill anybody. Because I mean, you know, you're killing this Russian, you know, you don't know who's who. So tell me about some of the experiences, and then we're gonna shift over to Black Lives Matter and some of the stuff that's going on now.
Well, my introduction, if you will, into the racism that exists on LAPD and every other of the 18,000 police departments across the nation was immediate in the police academy. I mean, they weren't playing. I was one of two Black females in a class of 20 women. There were 20 guys, 20 girls, but only two of us were Black females. And, you know, they didn't make any bones about not really appreciating the fact that we were there. We had guys who would come up to the police academy and just watch us train and watch us do physical training, because we were kind of like a science project. They had never seen that many women in one academy class. And so they too would kind of yell out things as we were running past them, because it was quasi-military, the way the police academy was set up, and we had to run everywhere. And you know, you didn't speak to anybody, but they would certainly taunt and jeer at us. And so, but I had quit my job to do this. And while I wasn't really sure what was coming, I knew I needed to get out of that academy because I had quit my job to join. And so I just had to figure it out. 6 months in the police academy. We didn't live there. We would show up every day, have classroom training, have firearms training, and then we would have physical training, physical agility type stuff. And so I just looked at it, you know, they got 8 hours to just beat me up every day, and they're paying me to do it. And I graduated. And then once I graduated and I went to my first division of assignment, the officers that I was put with as my first training officers scared the bejesus out of me, because they were would be described two hard charging white boys, and I was working graveyard.
Wow.
And I thought, oh Lord, this is a setup. They are surely trying to get rid of me through attrition. And again, I just thought I've got to get through this 12-month probationary period. But my first two training officers were really, they looked rough and gruff, but they were amazing. They made sure that I learned everything that I could in terms of what it meant to be a good police officer, how to handle radio calls, how to deal with conflict, I'm a young 20-something going into people's houses in the midst of a family dispute, and the husband and wife are arguing, and they've been married more years than I had been on the earth. And here I am there to resolve that conflict. And so I really did have a lot of good training officers, but I also worked with some wackadoodles. And I talk about that in my autobiography, Black and Blue, The Creation of a Social Advocate. But once I got off probation and I was no longer an at-will employee, now vested, I had a little more latitude and a little more freedom to kind of be me. And so that's exactly what I did.
That's amazing. And only two of you ended up, making it out of the 20. But I can understand that. When I was a commissioner, I did the ride along too. I forgot to tell you about that. And that was some scary stuff. I'm just riding along with the police officer to see what a normal day is like. So I don't know how you made it, but I'm glad that you did, and you can tell your story. What is the worst case or assignment that you had?
Well, I guess it would depend on what you mean by worse. I mean, if you're talking about shitty, I had a couple of those. The things that other officers didn't want to do, and because I was new, I really didn't have much to say. And so when I was working downtown Los Angeles, we had a B wagon, paddy wagon, right? And we used to ride around all day and pick up drunks, and that was that was a shitty detail. And back then, being drunk in public was actually a crime that you could arrest someone for. So we had the beat cops who walked downtown Los Angeles, and they would get calls from store owners, business owners who were complaining that homeless people were sleeping in front of their doorstep and doing things that homeless people do when they live on the street in their doorstep. And most of them were drunk, because you almost have to be drunk to be on the streets of Los Angeles or any other. So the officers would call the B wagon, and we would show up, and they would do what we called a short form little arrest report, like a ticket. And they would fill it out with the person's name, information. They put them in the back of the paddy wagon. We'd collect about 10 or 12 of them driving around, and we take them over to Parker Center, which is where we used to book them for being drunk in public. They'd keep them for a couple of hours, and then they'd let them go. And like homing pigeons, they would go right back to the place that we picked them up on. And so I worked that detail for about 2 or 3 months, and that was my day, every day, all day. So that was, yeah, not so much fun.
So what about dangers? I mean, well, okay, so I think that's what what was your most dangerous assignment?
Well, I don't know, there were probably some things that some dangerous situations that I dodged, and I had no knowledge of it, right? But there were certainly lots of opportunities for things to go sideways, because in the 80s here in Los Angeles, gangs were really prolific. I worked the gang unit as a gang suppression officer, and we had drive-by shootings all the time. And so there was always the potential for something to go sideways. I worked with people who are much like what we see on the national news, folks who are not happy to see me because I'm me, a Black woman, and like them, not happy to see me because I'm going to ultimately have to take them to jail for the thing that they did. I had nothing to do with it, but I have a job. And there were people who were uncooperative. There were people who ran from me. There were people who wanted to fight me, and I did fight with folks. But I never took it personal, because I knew that their angst wasn't with me. They don't know me. They just know the uniform. And I had made up my mind when I joined LAPD, understanding the history and what had been going on in the area where I was living with family and friends and others, that whenever I did make it out of the academy and became a police officer, I was just going to treat people with dignity and respect, the same way I would want anyone to treat a family member of mine. And so I did that. And I think that's why I was successful. The other thing that I think worked in my favor is because there were so few Black women on the job. Certainly I was a trailblazer. I'm clear on who I am. And I went through some stuff and made it possible for the others who came behind me. And the stuff that I went through, I didn't always go through it silently. But I realized that, there were times when I worked with what I call errant officers, folks who are like Derek Chauvin, who we saw sit on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, who are constantly involved in shenanigans. But when they work with me, since they didn't really know what to make of me and they didn't know if I had their back, that's a big thing on LAPD and other departments. Can your partner trust you? So for me, since they didn't really know if they could trust me, they didn't do the foolishness that they might normally do with a regular partner. They waited until their regular partner was back and they weren't saddled with me for the day to do, whatever it is that they might have been inclined to do, whether it's treating people poorly, talking to folks, using force unnecessarily. So I really never found myself in situations where I had to deal with a partner who was doing something that was akin to police misconduct and I needed to report it. They just didn't do it in front of me.
So I know that it went on, even though they didn't do it in front of you. You heard about it. I mean, because I know it's been happening. I mean, I think it was Will Smith said, it didn't just start. We're just filming it. It's on film now. Back then it wasn't. How did you deal with when you heard some stories of Black and brown people being treated like George Floyd and Trayvon Martin and all the other ones?
Well, hearing that something may have occurred out in the field is a whole lot different from seeing it, just like any other, criminal act or policy violation. If you're not a witness to it, you can't speak on it. You certainly couldn't testify in a court to it. You couldn't testify in an administrative hearing to something that you didn't see. But there were officers that I knew and worked with who I knew had animus towards the Black community. And there's one who I've been speaking on pretty regularly lately because I want people to know who he is. And I don't have a problem naming names, but I was working in a unit called Central Traffic Division, and we were primarily responsible for investigating traffic accidents. And when we would investigate a traffic accident, there were always tow truck drivers back then who used to carry scanners. And if they would hear an accident come over the police radio, the scanner that was in their tow truck, they would show up to tow the car out of the intersection. Well, when I'm there, I don't care who gets the car out the intersection. I just want it clear so traffic can proceed. But there was an officer that I worked with in Central Traffic Division, and his name is Douglas Iverson. Douglas Iverson hated Black folks. He hated me. He messed with me within that division. It was well known. He had been like a Derek Chauvin, stacking up personnel complaints, and LAPD looked the other way and didn't do anything about it, even though they knew he was out of control, until one day they could no longer look the other way. And what happened on this particular day in 1992, he had towed the truck of a Black tow truck driver by the name of John Daniels. Anyone who's interested can Google this and see the story. He had towed Mr. Daniels' truck early in his shift, and Mr. Daniels was able to somehow get his tow truck out of the impound yard before Douglas Iverson's shift ended. Later in the day, Douglas Iverson saw him at a gas station putting gas in his tow truck over on Crenshaw and Florence. And Mr. Daniels saw Iverson because they had been doing this dance for a long time. And he felt bad about what was about to happen. And Douglas Iverson approached him. But before he did that, Mr. Daniels had gone to the person that was working in the gas station and wrote a number down and said, if anything happens to me, call this number, because he just had a bad feeling. Douglas Iverson went over and confronted him. Now, what was said, I don't know, but I can kind of imagine, knowing the personality of this officer, he probably was trying to figure out, how did this Negro get this truck back? I thought I took it from him. I guess I didn't do a good enough job, right? Messing with him. And so Mr. Daniels gassed up his car because he's like, dude, what? I got my truck. I have no words for you. He got in his truck and he was trying to drive away. In him trying to drive away, Douglas Iverson shoots him and kills him. Oh. And the reason that he gave for killing Mr. Daniels is he said he thought he was going to run over someone that was nearby on a bus bench, and he was protecting pedestrians in the area.
And he got away with it?
He got away with it insofar as he was tried 3 times criminally. I actually testified against him at his 3rd trial. But, that was the time when, much like now, jurors give officers great deference. They give them the benefit of the doubt. And whatever story Iverson came up with and stuck to, I was in fear that he was going to run over somebody. And that's why I shot and killed him, because it just makes sense. If you want to protect pedestrians, you kill somebody who's driving a tow truck while they're driving the tow truck, right? But a jury never was able to unanimously agree. It was hung all 3 times. And then after the 3rd time, the district attorney that was prosecuting pretty much had given up. But those are the kinds of things that went on back then. People were complaining about folks like Douglas Iverson, like they complained, I'm sure, about Derek Chauvin. We know he had 18 personnel complaints before he murdered George Floyd. We know that Garrett Roth, the officer who shot and killed, murdered Rayshard Brooks, had over a dozen personnel complaints. And so there are always red flags. There's always a history when we find out by the time it makes national news that this officer had been cutting up their entire career. And as I've been speaking about those 2 particular cases and others, I've said, wouldn't it have been nice if the police chief over there in Atlanta did their job at personnel complaints 6, 7, 10, 12 and got rid of Derek Chauvin? He lived to offend again. And it wasn't until he murdered this man that finally they had to do a punctious pilot and terminate him. If Mr. Floyd hadn't died, it probably would have been just another Black person complaining about maltreatment and everybody just kind of shuffling it under the carpet and doing nothing without, public outrage like we have in the Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and a few other cases that is starting to get some momentum. Absent that, they act like we're just pulling stuff out of our nether regions.
Yeah, and it's amazing at the excuses, and it's not just the cops, but Aubrey, it was just 3 men. I mean, Trayvon Martin. I mean, just a regular citizen. It seems like anybody can get away with it, not just the police. You can just say, "Oh, I felt threatened, and so I killed them," and they're getting off. So,
and there was history, and I don't know if everyone knows this, but I think it bears mentioning. There was history between Gregory McMichael, the father, and Ahmaud Arbery. Gregory McMichael was once a police officer there in Glenn County. And when he was a police officer, something must have been amiss about him because he didn't stay there very long. He went on to do other things, boat salesman, beer salesman, and then he came back to the district attorney's office to work as an investigator. Now, while he was working in the DA's office as one of their investigators, he was in charge of investigating an incident that involved Ahmaud Arbery when he was in high school. I believe the story goes, he went to school with a weapon and he was charged. Gregory McMichael was the investigator on that case, along with the son of the police captain or another DA there in the county. So there was history. Now, Ahmaud was given 5 years probation. I believe that Gregory McMichael, based on their history, probably was a little pissed off that he couldn't get this young Black man further into the system. And he knew him from the area. He saw him walking around, and we now know that Glenn County Police Department had told the owner of that home under construction, hey, if you see this guy, don't call us, call Greg McMichael. He's a good guy. He'll take care of it. Who does that? And so I think that this was much of what we see. This was an opportunity for Gregory McMichael, a frustrated wannabe cop, to punish this young Black man because he didn't get him as good as he wanted to back when he was a DA investigator. And I hope that his history and the fact that he was a police officer will hold some weight once this thing finally gets in front of a jury, because he was way more than just an average citizen who decided to deputize himself. He knew better, he was trained, and he should have done better.
So let's talk about this chokehold neck thing. Because I mean, it seems like because they're banning it. I never knew it existed. Talk about that.
Well, most of what we hear from politicians, and it's very disappointing to me because it's all doublespeak. It's code talk. And listen, Daniel Pantaleo on the NYPD used a prohibited chokehold in 2014 when he choked Eric Garner to death. So understand that the mere banning of a chokehold, prohibiting a chokehold, is not going to stop police officers who are in patrol from doing that. We see examples of it since Mr. Floyd was murdered. I've seen pictures. There's a female right now on the San Francisco Police Department who's being investigated because she put her knee on the neck of a young Black teenager, taking him into custody. And the police union in San Francisco said, oh, that wasn't that wasn't a chokehold. It wasn't a knee on the neck. It was a department approved way to effect an arrest. We heard that same foolishness with Pantaleo. They said, oh, that wasn't a chokehold. That was an upper body seatbelt restraint hold. And so they're so disingenuous when they pretend like this is real reform that they're seeking. They will continue to choke folks whenever they want to. They will continue to sit on folks' neck whenever they want to. And they'll tell us, well, no, that's not what you saw. That's not what they did. And they'll give it another name. And so it's all very disheartening, because what is being proposed, some of it is already in effect. They talk about de-escalation of force. Police officers have always been required to de-escalate. Once you get someone in custody, once handcuffs go on, like in the case of George Floyd, it's over. There's no reason to sit on his neck, not 1 minute, not 2 minutes, not 8 minutes and 46 seconds. He's in handcuffs. He's in custody. He's under your care and control, and you should be looking out for him, not punishing him, and certainly not to the extent where it ends up in a murder. And so these things already exist. Officers are required to only use deadly force. We have an acronym, IDOL, I-D-O-L, immediate defense of life. In other words, when you've exhausted every other alternative that you have, and the only thing left to do to save your life or the life of another is to use deadly force, that's already policy. When they talk about decertifying officers or requiring officers to be certified, is what this crazy ass in the White House said. You know, we're going to make sure that officers are certified. We already are. Peace officer standards and training is the certification that every officer has. And so as you listen, pay particular attention to what these folks are pretending to put forth as police reform. And what I want to hear them say is that 4-letter word that none of them will utter: accountability. Hold police officers accountable personally. Get rid of qualified immunity. You heard Representative Congressman Tim Scott. Here's a Black man who said getting rid of qualified immunity is a non-starter for him. We won't even discuss it if you want to talk about qualified immunity, because qualified immunity is the thing that prevents police officers, when they do violate policy and commit murder, from being held personally responsible. So if you're really about reform, if you really want to stop the bad behavior, you would do something that would deter it. Because I promise you, if a police officer had to pay just 1% of a civil suit because they murdered someone, the others would stop this stuff yesterday.
So, talk about mental illness now. I also sat on the police review board. So you know what that's like. I got to look at the footage after the community made a complaint to make sure that the rights of the community were not being violated by the police. I did that for 3 years. And I saw some things. But the thing that disturbed me the most, Cheryl, is most of the people that I saw had mental illness. And the police either, I mean, I'm not a professional, but I could see it. Either they didn't want to see it, or, you know, I don't understand that. You can tell when somebody's a little off, right?
Absolutely. And listen, I understand that training varies from department to department based on resources and monies that are available. I get that. But, you know, I say all the time, if sense were common, everyone would have it. So let's start with that. But to your point, you know when someone is having some sort of a mental episode. And so it would be nice if officers would show a little empathy and compassion. If that's not in your core, if that's not who you have, you can't teach it. You can't make them. And so again, when an officer fails to do that, much like you went through those situation simulations, that's what we called them on LAPD, the sit sims, where you have shoot, don't shoot scenarios. What would you do? We train and we practice in the police academy. We continue to have in-service training where we go over these kinds of techniques so that when you get in a situation, you don't really have to think about what you're going to do because you've been practicing, and you play like you practice. It's second nature. But if you don't care about that person, if you look at somebody who looks like me and you don't, then you don't think that I could be your mother, your sister, your aunt. And so you're not going to take particular care when you deal with me. And that's why we continue to see instances where officers are just shooting and killing, and then they come up with a version because the dead person can't tell you what they were intending or not. We see instances where officers encounter someone who's having an episode and they're behind the wheel of a car. You don't have the luxury of saying, time out, let me call a clinician and have them meet us here and talk to you. You go to someone's home because of a domestic dispute, and you find out that someone may be bipolar or schizophrenic, or a family member calls, and you don't have the luxury of calling a medical professional to meet you there. Officers, to some extent, we're not doing anything different than what we've always been expected to do. And that's just use some common sense, rely on your training, and treat people the way you would want someone to treat your loved one. It's not that difficult.
How much time do you all get on training on de-escalating, and I guess it would be probably two different things, and sensitivity?
It just depends on the department, because part of what peace officer standards and training, and it may be called something different from department to department, but everybody has an entity that oversees, manages training. And they require you in the police academy to have so many hours a week of, law, so many hours of firearms training, so many hours of tactical training. And so once you get out of the police academy, post still requires, if you want to remain certified, you have to continue to have this ongoing education. And they determine how many hours each agency should require their officers to undergo. So when you hear folks say that training is an issue and officers need to be better trained, they're well trained. Officers need to be held accountable, because until you hold them accountable, they're going to continue to do the things that they do. They've now learned that all they have to say is, I feared for my safety. And nobody asked the next 3 or 4 questions that I think should be asked of every officer who uses deadly force. Why? When? What happened that made you feel that way? Okay, I get, when you fired the first 2 bullets, you were fearful, but the person is now down on the ground. Like recently here in Los Angeles, we had a female police officer who shot and killed a man who seemed to be going through something, involved in a traffic accident. He had a box cutter in his hand, and the officers just happened upon the scene of the traffic collision, and the man with the box cutter started walking in the direction of the officers. He was some distance away, at least 2 or 3 car lengths away. But when LAPD reported on it, they said that the man was advancing, because doesn't that sound hairy and scary? He's advancing on the officers, and then they say an officer-involved shooting occurred. Well, that's not exactly what happened. He took a couple of steps in the direction of the officers. They had already been warned as they were coming there that there was a man who had been involved in a traffic accident who was sitting in his car, and the person who called 911 said, he's trying to kill himself. Dispatch asked, what do you mean? And they said, he's cutting himself. So it sounds like he was either trying to commit suicide by cop, by being uncooperative, or he was having some sort of a mental situation, or he was under the influence. And so this officer, this female officer, her name is Toni McBride, and she is the daughter of the president of the Los Angeles Police Protective League, our union. She shot this man 6 times. Now, the first 2 times when she shot him, he fell, and there's a pause. And then she shot him 2 more times. He's on the ground, not moving. There's a pause. And then she shot him 2 more times.
This is crazy.
Why is she in fear? What was it that made her fearful after the first 2? And why not wait a minute or 2? Because yeah, he's being uncooperative, but like you said, you can see something's wrong with him. He's not acting coherent. And he's not running towards her, because I understand that a man with a knife can close the distance between you and him very quickly if he's running towards you. But there's video out there of it. LAPD tries to narrate it and tell us what we saw, because that's what happens. And he's not running towards them. He took a 2-step, stopped, and maybe he just stopped because he wasn't going to go any further. We don't know, because he's dead. He can't tell us what his intentions were. So now we have to rely on the officer to tell us what her perception was, and a jury may give her great deference given her familial relationship to the president of the Los Angeles Police Protective League, our union.
Are Black and brown people the only people? I mean, we don't hear about any white people being killed in the street. I mean, I'm sure that it has happened, but why is that?
I think well, there's a couple of things. It doesn't happen to the same extent that it does in our communities. And I think a lot of times when it happens to young white kids, we don't hear about it for a number of reasons. I've had family members, I've had parents, mothers of young whites who have been murdered by police reach out to me and say, hey, could you talk about my son's case? I know I appeared on Dr. Phil with a family. Zachary Hammond was the young man's name, who was shot and killed by a police officer. He was sitting in a parked car with his girlfriend, first time they were out on a little date in a park. And a police officer pulled up and saw them sitting in the car, and something about maybe some marijuana might have been involved. And the officer was a lieutenant, high-ranking officer in plain clothes, and approached the car. And Zachary didn't know who he was walking up on his car, so he decided to start his car up to drive off. And this lieutenant shoots in the car and kills him. There's another young man that I'm familiar with, Dylan Noble in Fresno, California. He was involved in some sort of a situation. I think he had been drinking, so obviously he's impaired, and didn't stop for police. I think there was a police pursuit, and officers wound up shooting into his car and killing him. Samantha Ramsey, a young girl who was attending a party with some friends, and as they were leaving, officers were trying to flag and stop the kids because they heard there was underage drinking, and the car that she was a passenger in didn't stop. Officers shot at the fleeing vehicle, killed her. So no one is immune, be clear, but it happens to us certainly much more disproportionately than it does to other ethnicities.
Wow, this has been very informative. I thank you so much for what you do, because there aren't that many people that are out there and letting people know, what's going on. What I'd like to ask you is, could you speak to our audience? Because I know I can't even say that there's anything that you could tell them not to do, because there's been people that have had nothing, like the young man that the violin player that they just killed. So they say put your hands on the. There really is nothing that we could do, is it?
Well, the problem is you don't know the temperament of the officer who has stopped you. And so when I speak across the country, I have a campaign, and it's called Comply and Complain. And what I say to young folks, old folks, is the same thing that I say to my own sons. I have 4. And I say, comply with whatever it is an officer tells you. That doesn't guarantee that you will survive the encounter, but the goal is, with any police encounter, to make it home safely, right? And so you do what the officer says. We can record legally, but if you start recording, it could piss somebody off, and you don't know who you just pulled out of that grab bag. And so now I'm learning that there's an app for anyone who has an iPhone. And if you just say, Siri, I've been pulled over, or Siri, the police are stopping me, there's something, and folks can Google that as well. Your phone will start to surreptitiously not only record the encounter, but notify whoever you have asked the program to notify, and give your location, so that you don't alert the officer and make them mad and become what I call victim of contempt of cop, piss them off. There's a price to pay. So you do the best that you can. You try to follow their instructions, because when we don't, we see what happens when you don't turn around like Eric Garner didn't do. You see what happens when you're told to put a cigarette out, like Sandra Bland, and you have a question about why you're being stopped in the first place. When you see someone who has a warrant for maybe not paying child support, as in the case of Walter Scott, and he got out of his car and ran, and Michael Schlager shot him in the back 8 times. So we know it will end badly if you try to run, if you fight with police, even if you think the officer is dead wrong, because as I say, once an officer kills you, there's only one version that will be told, and that is theirs. So the goal is survive police encounters, make it home safely.
Wow, well, that's good information. I kind of just had a flashback. Do you remember the guy that they killed and was sitting in the car with his girlfriend and came up to the car and it was on Facebook?
Philando Castile, yes, and he told the officer, "Hey, I'm licensed to carry. What do you want me to do?" You know, so again, when you got a fool, what can you do? You do everything right. You identify yourself, you know, and listen, I say no one is immune because I get stopped, right? They don't know who I am when I get stopped. I know what to say when I get stopped to kind of disarm the person that has stopped me. I start speaking their lingo. But I would say to anyone else, certainly if you're armed and you're in a state where you can carry legally, I would say, "Officer, I'm armed. I am not going to move. I'm not going to get my driver's license. I'm not going to reach for my vehicle registration. Could you please, sir, I want you to feel comfortable. Could you please get another unit? Get me out of this car, handcuff me, and then go in my pockets for yourself." It may sound extreme, but these are extreme circumstances. And I would rather be inconvenienced and handcuffed by them than to reach, as Philando Castile did, and wind up being shot at 7 times.
Wow. Well, Cheryl, thank you so much. Closing remarks.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak to your audience, and I want everyone to know, if you are interested in more about what I say, I do have a YouTube channel, Sergeant Dorsey Speaks, and that's the abbreviation SGT, Sergeant Dorsey Speaks. And I also have a weekly podcast where I talk about things that are happening across the country. I dissect what went wrong, what went right, and more importantly, what we can do about it, because it doesn't do us any good to just know that these atrocities are occurring. It's important to know that every police chief serves at the pleasure of a mayor who's an elected official. District attorneys are elected. Governors are elected. We're in the midst of an election coming up in November. The Supreme Court is on the balance. It's very important that we get involved, that we vote, that we pay attention to jury summons so that we can get on these juries and be a part of that process. And also, I say, join police departments across the nation. If you want to be a part of the change, you need to help make that happen from the inside. And so I speak about these things on my YouTube channel, on my podcast, Sergeant Dorsey Speaks, and also for anyone who's interested in learning more about my career and the advocacy work that I have done over the last 6 years, you can purchase my autobiography at my website, sgtcheryldorsey.com.
Can you bring your book up, show them your book?
Sure, right. So this is it. This is my autobiography, Black and Blue, The Creation of a Social Advocate. I'll send you an autographed copy if you go to my website, sergeantcheryldorsey.com, or if you just want a garden variety version, you can purchase it on Amazon. It's also in ebook format.
My autograph copy. I should have had one years ago.
We'll have to talk about that off camera. How about that?
Throw that out there. Well, this is good, but you also can catch Cheryl. She's all over the place. I've seen you on CNN, MSNBC. You're everywhere, but you are such a sweet and humble person. That you really care for people, because you wouldn't put so much time into doing what you do if you didn't. So I want to personally thank you. And I'm sure that all of our followers, they've been waiting. They were upset that I wouldn't let them come in, but I said, you're going to see this, the interview afterwards, because this is how we're going to do this one. But I really, truly thank you for this time. We got to do it again. I have another request for you. I'll hit you up after we end the broadcast. We want to thank everyone who tunes in. We ask that you share this broadcast because I'm sure that it will help many people. And also follow us on Facebook, Black Women Empowered Incorporated, 1.9 million followers on our main page. We have over 4 million across Facebook, Pinterest, BWE CEO, Instagram, BWE CEO, and LinkedIn, Black Women Empowered Incorporated. We just hit 41,000 followers on there. Until the next time, God bless.